Sandra didn't raise her voice when she said it. And that was exactly what made it feel deliberate instead of emotional. If you're going to keep living here, you'll need to start paying rent, she said, like it was a normal adjustment. Like she hadn't just rewritten my place in a house I had never once questioned belonging to me. I didn't respond immediately. I sat there, staring at the plate in front of me, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make everyone at the table aware that something had shifted. Her children didn't look surprised. That was the first detail I noticed. Not confused. Not curious. Just watching. Which meant this wasn't new. It was just the first time she had decided to say it out loud. I lifted my gaze slowly and asked one question. Calm. Controlled. Almost detached. So they don't pay anything? Sandra didn't hesitate. They're still figuring things out, she replied, dabbing her mouth with a napkin as if the conversation had already been settled. That answer didn't frustrate me. It clarified something I should have understood a long time ago. Because suddenly, every small imbalance made sense. The expectations placed on me, the responsibilities that had quietly become mine, the way I had been positioned without ever being asked. I leaned back slightly, studying her for a moment, then said, "Then I think we need to clarify something first." She smiled, confident, certain she was still in control of the situation. She wasn't. What she didn't realize was that this conversation had already moved somewhere she no longer had authority to follow. I didn't argue with her. That would have been predictable. And predictable reactions are easy to manage. Instead, I let the moment pass, at least on the surface. I finished dinner in silence, stood up, and walked away like nothing had changed. But something had. Not in the way she expected. Not emotionally. Not visibly. But structurally, because once a system reveals itself, you can't go back to pretending you don't see it. That night, I stayed awake longer than usual, not replaying what she said, but re-examining everything that had led up to it. The expectations that had gradually shifted onto me. The way responsibilities were assigned without discussion. The quiet assumption that I would handle things while everyone else remained comfortably uninvolved. It hadn't happened all at once. That was the point. It had been slow, controlled, almost invisible. And that was what made it effective. By the time it became obvious, it already felt normal. The next morning, I didn't change anything dramatically. I followed the same routine, moved through the same spaces, spoke the same way. But internally, I stopped participating in the version of reality they relied on. I started observing instead. Who did what? Who expected what? Who benefited from what? Patterns began to form almost immediately. The imbalance wasn't random. It was maintained. And more importantly, it was protected. That was when I understood something that mattered more than anything she had said the night before. This wasn't about rent. It was about control. About slowly redefining my position until I no longer had the authority to question it. And once I saw that clearly, the next step wasn't reaction. It was adjustment. Because systems like that don't collapse when you argue with them. They collapse when you stop supporting them. If you realized you were being slowly pushed into a role you never agreed to, would you speak up immediately? Or stay quiet and start taking control back step by step? Comment your move. The opportunity to clarify everything came sooner than I expected. And when it did, I didn't rush it. Moments like that lose their impact when they're forced. So I waited until we were all at the table again. The same setting. The same structure she had used the night before. Like nothing had changed. That was what made it effective. Familiarity lowers defenses. I let the conversation move naturally at first. Small talk. Routine exchanges. Nothing significant. Then, without raising my voice or shifting my tone, I said, "Before we talk about rent again, there's something you should probably understand." Sandra looked at me, still composed, still confident, as if she was about to correct a misunderstanding. I held her gaze for a second before continuing. This house isn't yours to manage. It's mine. The silence that followed wasn't immediate disbelief. It was processing. Then came the reactions. Almost exactly in the order I expected. Amusement first. A short laugh. Light. Dismissive. Then confusion. Then the first signs of discomfort. Sandra reached for her phone quickly, calling my father. Not to confirm, but to correct what she assumed was a mistake. I didn't interrupt. I didn't explain. I let the call play out on speaker, every word landing exactly where it needed to. When he confirmed it, quietly, without resistance, without emphasis, just a simple statement of fact, the room changed in a way that couldn't be undone. Sandra didn't collapse. That would have been easier. Instead, she recalculated. Her expression tightened slightly. Her posture adjusted. Her tone softened. That was when I knew something important. She wasn't finished. She was adapting. And that meant this wasn't a resolution. It was a shift in phase. Because once control is challenged, it doesn't disappear. It changes form. And now that I understood exactly what I was dealing with, I didn't need to prove anything else. I just needed to decide what to do with it. The shift didn't trigger an argument, and that was exactly why it worked. Sandra didn't push back immediately. She adjusted. The next morning, her tone changed. Softer. More measured. Like she was trying to restore something without directly acknowledging it had been disrupted. She spoke to me more carefully. Asked questions she hadn't asked before. Offered small gestures that looked like compromise on the surface but felt calculated underneath. It wasn't reconciliation. It was repositioning. I didn't respond to it. Not by rejecting it. Not by accepting it. But by removing the space where it could take effect. Then I heard the next move. She was on the phone with my father again, suggesting I move out for college, framing it as independence, as growth, as something that would benefit me long term. It was subtle, almost reasonable, if you ignored the timing. But timing is where intent reveals itself. She wasn't trying to fix the situation. She was trying to relocate the problem. And that made my next step simple. I didn't confront her about the call. I didn't expose what I had heard. Instead, I waited until we were all in the same room again. The same environment where she had tried to establish control the first time. Then, as casually as she had once introduced the idea of rent to me, I introduced something new. Starting next month, anyone living here will be contributing. I said, my tone even, unchallenged. The reaction was immediate this time. Not confusion, but resistance. Questions. Objections. Attempts to reframe the situation back into something familiar. But I didn't engage with any of it. You wanted structure. I added calmly. Now we have it. And for the first time, the rules weren't being applied to me. They were being applied to everyone. The resistance didn't come all at once. It showed in small delays first. Missed deadlines. Partial payments. Excuses that sounded temporary but repeated too often to be accidental. Sandra framed it as adjustment, as something that just needed time. James ignored it entirely, acting like it would disappear if he refused to acknowledge it. Melissa tried to negotiate, softening her tone, offering explanations that weren't solutions. None of it changed anything. Because for the first time, the structure didn't depend on their cooperation. It existed whether they accepted it or not. And that was what unsettled them. They weren't used to rules that didn't bend. Sandra tried to regain control the only way she knew how. By shifting the narrative, she spoke to my father again, created tension in the house, implied that I was overreacting, that I was being unreasonable, that I was disrupting something that had always worked. But what she failed to understand was that it had only worked for her. Now that everything was visible, the imbalance couldn't be hidden behind tone or intention anymore. Every argument she made revealed more than it defended. Every attempt to reposition herself only made the original pattern clearer. And, slowly, that started to affect the others. James became quieter, less certain. Melissa stopped pushing back altogether. Even Sandra's confidence began to fracture. Not outwardly, but in the pauses between her words, in the way she hesitated before speaking, in the way she started choosing silence over control when she couldn't predict the outcome. I didn't escalate. I didn't need to. I just held the structure in place, consistently, without exception. And over time, that did something more effective than any confrontation ever could. It forced them to operate in a reality they hadn't designed. And without that advantage, everything they relied on started to fall apart on its own. In the end, nothing dramatic happened. And that was what made it final. There was no explosion. No argument that reset everything into something familiar. Just a gradual shift that became permanent. Payments either came on time, or they didn't. And when they didn't, consequences followed. Not emotionally, not reactively, but consistently. Sandra stopped trying to reframe the situation. Not because she accepted it, but because she no longer had a position to argue from. James adapted in the only way he could. Quietly. Without acknowledgement. Melissa kept her distance. Speaking less. Avoiding conflict altogether. The house itself changed in ways that were difficult to explain but impossible to ignore. The tension didn't disappear. It settled into something structured. Something controlled. Something that no longer depended on manipulation to function. And that was the difference. I didn't remove them. I removed the system that had allowed them to define my role inside it. Once that was gone, everything else adjusted naturally. I didn't feel satisfied in the way people expect when things resolve like this. There was no sense of victory. No emotional release. Just clarity. The kind that comes when something finally aligns with what it was always supposed to be. The house didn't feel different because of them. It felt different because of me. Because for the first time, I wasn't adapting to a structure I didn't create. I was maintaining one that reflected reality. And once that was in place, there was nothing left to fix. So be honest, is this justice or control? And would you have stayed to take your power back? Or walked away completely? Drop your answer below. And if you want more stories like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.